that was both Russian and Yiddish. Oh, continue. It is being recorded. A pogrom is just the debate that we were having or discussion. What happened? Was it a riot? Was it an insurrection? Was it a march? Was it a movement? It was a pogrom, a violent act against a people. And so after this happened again in Illinois in 1908, the founders of the NAACP came together. Now, if you look at this, it's, it's white males and W.E.B. Du Bois together with Minister Springarm. And then we have Mary Ovington, a wonderful suffragette and Black advocate. But here you want to see this William Walling on the left, totally white, top of the pyramid scale. His grandparents were slave owners in Kentucky, and he became a socialist 2 generations away, and he married a Jewish woman, Anna Strunsky. And I notice I put her on the side, and this is why it's complicated. Strunsky was leading the way to create the NAACP, creating meetings, creating all the minutes and the files. I don't know, some women out there have always been the supportive spouse. In this case, she was an underlying presence within the NAACP, which was founded by Blacks, Jews, ministers, all to support the advancement. And here, even in its title, we're hearing some of the issues that we're dealing with now. Is it about amelioration, improving the lives of individual Black people towards a white status quo? Or is it really trying to address now, as we are in the 21st century, some of the systemic racist problems that are not the issues of trying to raise people up? The, how does Kendi call it? He calls it the white improvement strategy, or the white supremacist strategy that we cannot change. We need to change the status quo of how we talk about race relations with one another. Next slide, please. So that's the founding of the NAACP. And as we move forward into the 60s.
Remember that.
Hi. This is a wonderful quote. I just wanted you to see that. Oh no, come on back. We got a couple slides back.
I'm trying to manage participants in the.
Oh, please.
Which one?
Two slides back. Keep going back. Backwards. There we go. Okay. So here I wanted to continue to deconstruct some of the Black Jewish dialectics. And this is, I can say, to Black History Month. Martin Luther King is praised, may his memory be a blessing, as a social justice warrior, as a warrior for poverty, as a warrior of nonviolent movement. And I often think Malcolm X gets a different role that plays within this towards Black nationalism, a more militant African-American presence, and one that is seen as antithetical to the Jews. And I just know that at the end of their lives, this was a very different story. It's more complicated than that. When Malcolm X went to Hajj for the second time, he became a different type of Muslim and really did have a religious awakening. We could debate it, but it was a changing structure. And Martin Luther King was feeling under tremendous pressure, tremendous despair before his murder, and was shifting also in some of his ways, not towards militarism, but an understanding of America and his prayer and hope for truly society that represented all. These are complicated stories, and I think we do ourselves a disservice to simply look at the images that have been provided us and the stories that we've been given, and that just can perpetuate some of the racial stereotypes that we've had throughout history. So I just wanted to show you this picture. I don't know, I'm curious if anybody's seen this picture. I can't see your faces, so you don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's. This was a 60s advertisement. It's Levy's rye bread. Malcolm X saw the poster. He thought it was hysterical. And he said, I like this poster. Take a picture. Lenny, his friend who was Jewish, took a picture of this photograph of this advertisement. Makes it a more complicated story than just Malcolm X as Black nationalist versus the nonviolent Martin Luther King. I want to praise both in their aspects of complexity, not in the simple stories we tell one another year after year. On my right is Bayard Rustin, mentor of Martin Luther King Jr., a Quaker by nature, a man who transcended so many categories. Also in 1963, really the coordinator of the March on Washington. His story has been somewhat lowered in volume. In part, I think he was a gay man, and that is never or has been changing within the culture of African American communities. And also Bayard Rustin was a universalist at heart. He saw inequality as a problem of all humanity, but he was a Black man fighting for Black justice, and certainly as part of his work with SNCC and all of his work with Martin Luther King, proved his bona fides as a thinker, a deeply compassionate man. But one who I also want to mention here was throughout his life, pro-Israel. I won't say a Zionist, he didn't want to move there, but really saw the state of Israel separate than many other people in the 60s and 70s. Zionism and anti-Semitism and the African-American experience is a separate talk I would love. The name of this man is Bayard Rustin, Rustin, Bayard. You're welcome, Shana. And a wonderful example of someone who continued to fight for equalities across the spectrum. Next slide. Thank you. So here, I want to just share a little story within a story. This is from Ta-Nehisi Coates. Many of you know, he's actually the writer of the Black Panther comic book. He is an intellectual. He has written some powerful language, Between the World and Me. I mentioned him before because he said that Jews, Irish, and Italians, we have been successful in the last 50 years here in America because of the privilege of white skin, white privilege. And we have seen a growing distance between the Jewish and Black community since the 1970s over some of our economic disparities, a lack of mutual interest towards the same goals, perhaps, and that is a challenge. But here I want to see too, because Ta-Nehisi, as I read him, yes, it is. Amen. Thank you, Tori. Time on two crosses. Thank you. I wanted to show you here both a story about Ida B. Wells, one of my heroes, someone who really fought for social justice in 19th century, early 20th century in Chicago. But really, Paula Giddings' wonderful biography I'm going to read, who may be the mother of all Black journalists. And also, I want you to hear, this is from 2007. His writing is so powerful. Even that understates her significance. But the incident that kicks off Wells' career is a race riot in Memphis. So the Blacks in the towns, fearing such an occurrence, had organized themselves into a militia. They were called the Tennessee Rifles. You know who sold these cats guns? A local Jewish merchant who just happened to be a member of the Memphis relatively small Jewish community who defied his fellow Southern whites, meaning he got them arms to defend themselves. Now that's what I call a Black Jewish coalition. Screw getting our asses kicked together. Let's get some guns. Now, I don't know if I'm going to go as far as that line together, like getting either our asses kicked or militarizing ourselves, but I wanted to complicate the kind of story. And as I read so many of these histories, social histories of Jews in this century and Blacks, this story of the local merchant, often it was Jews who lived in the same communities as Blacks, as the Great Migration in the North. They were often the merchants, the tenants, and the landlords in places like Harlem and Chicago, and yes, Los Angeles. This created a lot of antagonism, and it also created a system of disparity. Now, sometimes that was just bad economics. Sometimes that were Jews taking advantage of Blacks, and other times it was just systemic racism. And what I want to point out here is sometimes these are bad actors, sometimes these are Jews being bad actors, and sometimes it is an institutional racism. And we have to say, and this is what I'm just encouraging you in this little drash today, It's complicated. Let's not assume motives before we hear narratives. Let's try to understand who we are in our complexities rather than seeing this story in quote unquote, sorry, excuse the pun, black and white. But let us also not get so complicated in our own discussions that we don't ever make some progress together in dialogue, understanding one another, and some action. That helps change the status quo. So I'm going to get to some points before I conclude, but I just wanted to give a little more interesting history. Did anybody know this story about Ida B. Wells in Memphis? You can raise your hand in the chat. Because it was new to me. It was new to me, and I love reading these little stories of Black Jewish history. Ava, next slide, please. So here, I wanted to point out Alyssa Garza and Black Lives Matter movement. She actually is a writer. She's one of our founders of Black Lives Matter. And she actually was the inventor of the hashtag Black Lives Matter. She writes in haiku. She's a powerful poet, social leader. But as you read her, and I'm not trying to, but let me just take a time out. I'm not trying to out anybody. I'm trying to say this is complicated. I'm not trying to out John Ossof and be like, guess what? He's not 100% Jew. See, not Jewish. Opposite. That's the opposite of what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say it's complicated. Alyssa Garza, founder of Black Lives Matter, very important figure in the last 10 years of how we see racial justice, protest, systemic racism. Alyssa Garza grew up as Alicia Swartz in Marin County. And if you look at her bio, it says she was born in Oakland and raised in the Bay Area. But if I told you, and this is where I like Jelani Cobb, he's really laying it. He's trying to really pose this complexity in this paragraph. She grew up in Marin County, where she was raised by her African-American mother and her Jewish stepfather, who ran an antique store. So that's not usually the picture that you would get of Alyssa Garza. Marin, antique store stepdaughter. And yet, this is part of our complex lives. Another part of this talk that would be a different discussion is Jews of color, how people define themselves as Jewish. Because as I said, many paternal, Judaism is a religion, Judaism is an ethnicity, Judaism is not a race, but it can also be considered a culture. And so where we define ourselves, and this is something I'm learning at Cal Poly, I am partly ethnic diversity, I am partly interfaith, but I am also part of this larger community of the Jewish people, which is faith, culture, ethnicity. And that's where Zionism becomes a different mode of how we communicate with one another as nationalisms, and that's a separate story. So I'd love to be able to bookend both Jews of color and that complex relationship and what Israel and Zionism is about. And I invite all of us to have more dialogue around these issues. But most important, this is complicated. Next slide, Ava, because I do want to leave minutes for conversation. Thank you. So here, I just wanted to further complicate the matters. Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I think everyone who's at least part of this conference has read it, imbibed it. He really does. I mean, each chapter, if you've seen it or read it, it's like you're either this or you're that. You're either an anti-racist would do this and a racist would do that. And he's really forcing many of us in this dialectic to choose and to change sides. And underlining this is a kind of a systemic racism that I think he really lays out well, both in his former book on history and this current book on policy. This is let me tell you, great. There are two kinds of people. The kind of people who think there are two kinds of people, and then the other kind of people. I'm the other kind of people. Does that make sense? Anyway, I can't see if you're smiling. So Paige, you smiled a little bit. So that's the only person I can see here. So I'm not this kind of person. I love the reading, and I listen to his work, and I support the actions of anti-racism. And yet I don't think it's so easy. I think it's complicated. And so here I'm pointing to another intellectual, a Thomas Chatterton Williams, and his writing. And I really encourage you to read some of his reflections of growing up as mixed race, of having a French wife and children who are seemingly white, and living in Paris. That's just one of his many writings that shows how complex race can be and identity. And I'm not telling you to support one rabbi over the other. These are rabbis. These are our teachers. And I include myself in that. And this is why Judaism, as a rabbi, God did not bequeath me with some holy power to know what is racism and what isn't. God said, go study, talk, be in humanity, say uncomfortable things. As we move to the next slide. These are two other books that one is Troubling the Waters, about race relations, which I've really enjoyed. These smaller stories, like Stokely Carmichael, his first political protest was in support of the state of Israel. Little things like that that I just would never imagine that I would read. These are little footnotes. And if you're in college and university, it's these small footnotes that make life complicated and beautiful. On the left, this is Mike Davis. He wrote A City is of Quartz, beautiful history of Los Angeles. Set the Night on Fire is a long book. It's a slog. But again, it shows how policy and communication, how complicated, not Jews and blacks, but Los Angeles was as it was morphing into a city through the 60s. Final slide, I just want to propose some questions before I open it up to questions from you. Look, I'm just going to be straight up. I've only been here 6 months, and here there's no there. I mean, Ava, you're at home outside of, Thousand Oaks. Paige, I have no idea where you are, but, here we are. But we're not here. But the status quo, as I've gotten here, between blacks and Jews, it's not that complicated. There is no great relationship between, and I'm not talking about Hillel and Black Student Union. If we talk about a kind of consortium between blacks and Jews, we have very little dialogue. We don't even have parallel monologue. When I presented just the opportunity for this talk, I just want to start a dialogue. I'm a rabbi, and I'm lecturing here, but I'd love to stay silent so we can hear. So I think them is the nastiest four-letter word. There are other four-letter words, but they do this, and what did they say, and what did they do? This is where we get in trouble, when we call thems. So dialogues are not parallel monologues. I'm giving a monologue right now, and I'm sure in a Q&A, if we did this for another hour, we could hear each having a monologue. That's not dialogue. That's not really hearing and asking deeper questions. We're just starting here. And again, please email me. I'd love social distance coffee. Yes, there was. Last week we did Joy. We had about 300 people at our anti-Semitism teach-in, but we put that together with Chabad, and it was a swastika, but that is not really, it wasn't germane to this moment, but it did show that there is both an awareness of kind of discrimination, and we were put onto that teach-in talk after this event. But it shows that, while there has been tremendous successes for the Jewish community in the last 40 years here in America, we're still a Jewish ethnicity that is under threat. So I wanted to give you this little Torah because I want to open it up for questions. If I'm not for me, who will be for me? Meaning I have to stand up for myself as an individual, family, community. But if I'm only for myself, who really am I? If we're too much isolated within our own groups, food Jew, FUBU, then really, what does it mean to be someone in the world? And I think there's no better time than the present. That's why this is not a lecture or a workshop as much as an invitation. And I just want to flow from the 50s melting pot, which was conceived as this America as this soup of unity, to the chop salad theory of kind of multiculturalism of the 80s and 90s. I think has now become a tapas America, where everybody is in their own small plates. And I don't want to move back to a melting pot, but I don't really like our status quo currently. And I'm saying this explicitly as an invitation for those who are Black or people of color to join with me, who's a, look, I don't even know if I'm Russian or Polish, but I came here, 100 years ago, and I'm deeply engaged in these conversations. Please, some questions and reflections as we close out the time together. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to either unmute themselves or write questions in the chat to continue dialogue, we have about 5 minutes left. For anybody who got here late, this presentation will be recorded and posted at a later date as well. So I invite you all to, keep the dialogue going. Again, if there's any questions in the chat, or I'll leave it open for anyone to unmute themselves at this time.
Hi, I have a question. So actually, I think it's interesting that you brought up how to be an anti-racist. I just recently read it for a class too. And I remember something in the book was like, in a racialized world, people have to kind of identify more with their races, because it's like, it's tricky, because if you do the whole melting pot thing and you put everybody in the same group, in a racialized world, it becomes more difficult to do that. So what's your opinion on that?
So here's where I love Jewish. And I think when I say it's in Deuteronomy, it says, "Hear, O Israel, the divine is all of ours, and yet the divine is unique." That's what I'm trying to say every day to myself. I have unique identity. I have a unique religion, faith. That doesn't make me less than. It doesn't make me better than. It simply makes me unique. And guess who else is unique? Everybody. Here's another great one. Andrew Solomon. It's called Far from the Tree. It's about apples don't fall far from the tree. And his theory is all these different people, whether you're a midget or you're a giant or you're deaf or you're a genius, it doesn't matter. You all feel equally different. That's where I want to get. And yet I know that with systemic racism and Black Lives Matter, I have received a disproportionate advantage than to some of my other brothers and sisters of color. I acknowledge that, and this is where philosophy of John Rawls comes in. I got to check my privilege. I got to watch that balance. I'm putting on some different weights as I enter this conversation, and that's why I begin with apology almost, in that I know where I stand, and I also know the humility necessary, but also a certain bravery to actually ask a question. I'm so sorry, Lorraine. Good. I'm glad the transcript is helping.
Thank you.
Well, in these closing seconds, again, invitation, please email me. Slow Hillel, while we're not directly on campus right now, we serve for Judaism and the Jewish community. And that means from Orthodox all the way to secular, from people who identify with Judaism or are interested in Judaism. We're here to serve these three different groups within an interfaith world, like we'll do an interfaith Seder April 8th, but to the diversity, this is why we're here on Status Quo. What do you do to elevate and give power? So what do? I hire people like Ari Kelman. I have people like Susanna Laundress, who's a Black rabbi in Boston. I make sure that I'm elevating voices that show diversity. And then my friend Ari Kelman is a professor at Stanford. What he did was change the way we look at diversity. A Pew study that says there's only 10% of color. So many people of color are afraid to do any of the Pew studies. He showed that it was up to 22% of people that are of color. Those are some of the ways. Look at the facts, see how it's complicated, ask better questions. Oh, there's not enough time. Let's have coffee distant. Please email me. Please, we should talk more. Please.
Yeah, so we're about ready to finish up. It is 1:45. Obviously, if anybody has any just last minute things, please put them in the chat. But before y'all go, I'm going to put the link to the survey in the chat, which will enter you for a giveaway to win Sonia Renee Taylor's book, as well as some other goodies, and you can kind of fill out a feedback form how the session went for you. So if y'all will just give me one moment to find the link to that, and I will put it in the chat for everybody.
Shirley,
That would be very
here's
helpful.
one other thing I want to say. This mug for cis, just for Jewish queers. My best friend was just honored for JQ with a cross-dressing Persian dancer. These are the ways. These are the organizations that can help us move Judaism to the next step. And I hope it's not an ouch. I hope it's an ouch that has a balm. I never want to hear ouch. I'm wishing you guys Shabbat Shalom, a day of peace. I'm glad we came to share together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rabbi Hyman.
Thank you. I look forward to meeting you.
Thank you.
Amen. Amen. To health, be well. So many good names. Angel.